My butternut squash mac and cheese recipe is easy and healthy. By replacing some of the cheese with oven roasted butternut squash, I'm going to make this classic comfort food lighter without sacrificing flavor. The star of this recipe is, of course, butternut squash. I started off with a 3-pound butternut squash. I peeled it, I cut it into slices. I took those slices and rubbed them with some butter, and then I roasted them in a 400-degree oven for these small slices, maybe 20 to 25 minutes. For these larger, thicker slices down here, maybe half an hour total, turning them halfway through the baking time. Although you definitely could microwave or boil or steam your butternut squash, I highly recommend that this recipe you bake it in the oven. Because in my opinion, steamed or microwave butternut squash is almost like a different vegetable compared to baked butternut squash. A few years ago, I developed a butternut squash pie recipe, and to be honest, it was kind of mediocre until I baked the squash in the oven. That was a game changer. Now it's one of my favorite pies. So even though it is a bit of, as the Argentines would say, quilombo, a bit of a hassle, a bit of a mess to roast the butternut squash in the oven, it's definitely worth it because it brings out so much flavor.
You could definitely use frozen butternut squash instead of fresh if you want. If the frozen butternut squash is already peeled and cut, I would buy 38 ounces or about 1,000 grams. However, one thing to consider is that, at least in my experience, frozen vegetables, when roasted in the oven, don't brown as nicely as fresh do. So it may be a bit harder to get that really roasted flavor, but I'm sure it would still be delicious.
Can't forget the pasta. Usually I use elbow macaroni for my mac and cheese, but since I'm changing up the recipe, I decided to change up the pasta, so I'm using half a pound or about 225 grams of whole wheat rotini. All I did is I brought some water to a boil on high, a little bit of salt. I put the pasta in there and I cooked it on high, gas mark 6 out of 6 for 12 minutes. Then I drained it. The butternut squash, I coated the slices in butter. I started off with a tablespoon, and what was left over, I greased my 8x8 casserole dish, and then I threw the rest in with the pasta. This is macaroni and cheese, so we can't forget the cheese. I'm using one 8-ounce block of Colby Jack. You could use cheddar. I would recommend a sharp cheddar, but honestly, I think pretty much any cheese would work. I'm also going to add spices. I am going to use a teaspoon each of garlic powder, onion powder, and black pepper. I know some people don't add spices to their mac and cheese, but it adds a ton of flavor. I know this is supposed to be a healthy recipe, but I'm going to add some sugar. Here I have a tablespoon of white sugar. I may or may not add all of it, but I think it's going to really help accentuate the sweetness of the butternut squash. And I think the sweetness of the butternut squash, along with the saltiness and tanginess of the cheese, the spices, and then also the smokiness of the ham, it's all going to work really well together. Speaking of the ham, I have about 4.5 ounces, about 130 grams of smoked ham. Like I said, I think it's going to add a ton of flavor, and it's going to add a bit more protein since there's less cheese.
You may be a bit surprised that I'm not making a roux for this mac and cheese. However, a lot of Southern style mac and cheese recipes are really easy because instead of using a roux, they use an egg and evaporated milk custard. So if you've never made macaroni and cheese before and you're a beginner cook, this recipe is perfect. Since I want the butternut squash to coat all of the noodles, the first step in assembling the macaroni and cheese is pureeing the butternut squash. Although I used a handheld immersion blender to mash the squash, you could use a food processor for sure. Although the immersion blender was great at mashing the squash, it didn't make a smooth puree. So, little by little, I added the evaporated milk and continued to puree the butternut squash. The bit of extra liquid really helped to liquefy the mashed butternut squash. After a few minutes, I had a silky smooth roasted butternut squash puree. Even though I was making mac and cheese, once I tasted this baked butternut squash puree with the evaporated milk, I honestly thought about just eating that. It was super delicious. But like I said, I was making macaroni and cheese, so the next step was to add the cooked noodles to the butternut squash puree. Once the baked butternut squash puree and noodles were thoroughly combined, I then mixed in the shredded cheese. Then I added the ham, sugar, and spices. I added the sugar and spices a little at a time so that I could taste as I went along. I ended up adding all of the sugar and all the spices, and after I tried it and decided that was what I wanted, I added the egg.
Now that my egg is mixed in, I'm simply going to pour my butternut squash mac and cheese mixture into my 8x8 casserole dish, spread it out, and then bake at 375. My butternut squash macaroni and cheese just came out of the oven. It was in at 375 uncovered for 45 minutes. It looks and smells amazing.
Honestly, I was really curious about this recipe. I kind of invented it after researching it a bit online, so I really didn't know quite what to expect. So I couldn't wait for it to cool down enough to try. Honestly, this butternut squash mac and cheese recipe was fantastic. Although my intention was for this to be a healthier version of macaroni and cheese, this was delicious in its own right. What I really liked about this casserole was the combination of flavors that you don't get in a normal mac and cheese recipe. First of all, the flavor of the butternut squash came through loud and clear. Baking it in the oven and then adding a little bit of sugar to accentuate the sweetness were great ideas. The sweetness of the butternut squash was balanced out by the cheese very nicely. The saltiness and tanginess of the Colby Jack working very, very well. I also liked what the smoked ham did in this recipe. Just like in the hash brown casserole that I made recently, my original intention with the ham was to add some extra protein, but what I realized is that the smokiness of the ham really contributed to the overall flavor of the dish. Along with the few spices that I added and the nuttiness of the whole wheat pasta, this butternut squash mac and cheese recipe was the best. Another great thing about it was that it was really easy because there was no roux. Although I honestly think that this turned out great as is, if you wanted to change it up a bit, I would add a bit of spice, maybe some crushed red pepper flakes or a little bit of hot sauce. I think a bit of heat would contrast nicely with the sweetness, tanginess, saltiness, and smokiness that are already in this dish. As I said earlier, my intention with this butternut squash macaroni and cheese recipe was to make a healthier version of classic comfort food by replacing some of the cheese with butternut squash. Even though this probably is lower in overall calories, it doesn't taste healthy. Since it has so many flavors working together in perfect harmony, it's good on its own right. So even if you are looking for healthier recipes in the new year, don't think of this dish as a substitution. Think of it as something that's delicious in its own right. I really hope you make this because if you do, I know that you'll fall in love with it at first bite. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.